away we go. I am here this evening.
So happy to welcome all of you.
I'm getting myself. That's not a good thing. I mean, I would love that, but I think everybody else would hate. One is enough. We are here with Dr. Marti Telcher. Marty, how are you doing?
Aside from being muted, I am fine.
It feels like it's been a very long time since we have had one of these conversations. Unfortunately, we're having another one. I would much rather speak to you about sports, politics, or just Torah in general. However, we are back here, and I would like to welcome you and thank you for being back. We are joined with an extremely large group of people. I would like to thank the leadership of the shul, and I'd like to embarrass publicly Karen Ritter for being at the forefront of spearheading a new wave of engagement of Congregation Beth Tikva with our community. And Karen's beliefs, as well as everybody who is here this evening, have proven to be correct, because we clearly do wish and would like an update concerning the Omicron variant, concerning where we stand with other variants, concerning where we stand with our health in general, and the state of the question on every single person's lips: when will this be over? I know you do not have a crystal ball, but in the meantime, perhaps you do have some information from a healthcare perspective, from a booster perspective, or a variety of other Q&As that we will open up at the end of tonight's session, and anybody who wishes to may ask any question. And we will see how we can move forwards, both in our lives and as well as a community. So, Marty, let me start by asking you, how are you feeling? Are you healthy? Are you doing well?
Thank God, everything's okay. Doing well, staying away from COVID. Pretty much leading a fairly boring life, but I guess that's what's required right now. But otherwise, things are fine. Thank you very much. How are you doing?
Baruch Hashem, I am excellent. I am very well. I'm healthy and I'm fine. I have coined a new phrase with my wife, which is, when our kids are in school, it's a great day.
Okay.
Once upon a time, the bar of expectation was here, and now the bar of expectation is somewhere lower. Yeah. When the kids are in school, it's a great day. So today was a good day. Okay. Let us begin. What can you please, I have a range and variety of questions. Other people do as well. What can you tell us as far as where we are up to in Montreal and Quebec, as far as those who are infected, in terms of those who are in hospitals? I don't know if you have the exact ICU numbers. Is our hospital system being overwhelmed? Is our hospital system able to maintain the current challenge of those who are sick? A snapshot of Montreal and Quebec, please.
Yeah, so it seems like with respect to hospitalizations, we've managed to come over what seems to have been the peak. But I'm going to say it's the peak during the mitigation measures as they stood then. So that means with schools opening, we managed to get the schools open, and that was before restaurants opening and before theaters opening and before bars and gyms and whatever else they're going to be opening in a couple of weeks. So we may be entering into a period of, instead of kind of rapid decline, more slow or stagnant decline, hopefully not an increase. Over the past week in Quebec, we managed to discharge, or there's also been fatalities, but there's 400 less patients admitted with or for COVID than last week. And I could tell you at the Jewish, over the past few days, the numbers have been dropping between 5 to 10 patients a day. So it's going in the right direction.
Excellent.
Yeah. Excellent. So it's encouraging, and hopefully, with the openings that are coming, we don't see an increase. They're going with a calendar-based system for opening as opposed to a benchmark system. So we'll see if their schedule holds and they're lucky, because it's a bit of a guess. But it looks good right now.
Allow me to ask you a foolish question. At least I think it is not a sophisticated one, but it's something I've been wondering about a lot. And that is that we were told that the numbers are coming down, and we were told that we are in a place where we're improving. However, the generalized PCR test that was available to the members of the public was suddenly stopped. And only in rare exceptional circumstances could you even get a PCR test. And the government protocol was, if you are feeling sick and your rapid test tells you that you are negative, nevertheless, you should quarantine. So we don't have any data, at least to my mind, as to how many people are indeed positive. So is that a fair statistical way of measuring the numbers coming down?
Yeah, right now there's no real effective way at predicting what's happening in the community. We don't know for sure. It's true that there were so many cases that happened suddenly all at once that it overwhelmed the testing system. It also happened around a time where people were getting ready to, get together for Christmas holiday, New Year's holiday, travel. So some people were using it not only because they thought they may have symptoms, but to clear themselves before they get together for, a large gathering, or to clear themselves before they get on a plane.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that really overwhelmed the system, and they had to basically shut it down and reserve it for people who are at higher risk. There were other systems that were in place that they stopped funding as well. One of the most notable is the wastewater project, which was a project where they were doing molecular analysis on the city's wastewater to see how much COVID they could detect.
Sorry, keep going.
Okay, so that stopped getting funded, so we lost that mark also. And then, they stopped reporting how many people were getting infected in schools. So they weren't compelling schools to announce, the number of infections, or to just let people know. So, it's up to schools and school boards and certain parents to sort of get that data together. But there was an announcement on the news today that there was something like, I don't know if it's true, but they said 50,000 students who are isolating at the moment, which is something like, they said it was about 3 to 4% of the entire student body of Quebec, and 2% of all teachers were actually out isolating. So that's a lot. So in the community, we don't know. The only thing we could follow at this time is hospitalizations. So that's the benchmark.
So according to the hospitalizations, the numbers are going down.
That's what's happening right now.
Okay, yeah. Another question, and I have a variety of questions, and I don't know if they're in a conceptual order, but the next question, in terms of the highest level of priority on my list, is I have heard the following. I have heard some people say that I'm fed up with this, I'm tired of all of this, enough already. Let me just catch the Omicron variant. Better that I should have COVID. I hear it's nothing worse than a bad cold, or maybe even a light cold if I'm now doubly vaccinated, or even triple with the booster. And I'll have antibodies in my system. I'll be healthier in the long term. It also helps if I'm flying out of the country. I don't have to pay $200 for an expensive PCR test to show at the airport. Better that I should get COVID and my life will be easier. What is your opinion on that philosophy?
Yeah, so it's a tricky question, because
I'm asking from a health perspective. It was gratuitous. I don't have to pay at the airport for an extra test. Forget the airport and those considerations. From a health perspective, what's your opinion?
Yeah, there's something to be said about that aspect nonetheless, because from a mental health perspective as well, because it's true that if someone does catch COVID, that all of a sudden, it's like the world kind of goes back to normal. If they don't suffer some of the long-term ramifications of having caught COVID. So from previous versions and variants of the virus, we know that somewhere between 10 and 20% of people could be left with various forms of what we call long COVID, or post-acute sequela of COVID. So it's sometimes called PASC, P-A-S-C. So some of these can be just the residual loss of smell and taste For some people, it's persistent coughing or shortness of breath. For some people, it's neurologic, and for some people, neurocognitive and psychiatric. And it's not to be diminished. And while it's true that those who are vaccinated probably have a 50% chance, like 50% better protection against these things than those who are not vaccinated, it's not completely understood for each variant what the actual risk of these types of long hauler or long COVID syndromes would be. So it's not like a regular cold. Even if you are vaccinated, if you have other illnesses, other comorbidities, you are still at risk of a poor outcome, compared to a healthy person who has no comorbidities. Granted, with increasing vaccination and especially with boosters, the risk of something, untoward happening diminishes dramatically. So it's not something that I think I would want to, jump into and just get randomly. Trust me, I have that opportunity on a daily basis multiple times.
Right.
And it's never come across my mind to take my mask off and go and hug the nearest COVID patient. So I still protect myself completely because I don't think it's something that I want. If I come across it, I come across it. It's the risk I accept every day that I'm seeing patients. But one thing I can say is that this variant is less severe than previous variants. So if you are to catch COVID now, you can put your mind at ease that the likelihood of something really bad happening is dramatically dropped just by the nature of this variant alone. It's not 100% clear as to why. It's much more transmissible, but it's much less virulent as well. So
thank you. I'm jumping around. Let's speak rapid tests for a moment. How effective are they? How trustworthy are they? And what should a person do? They're sick, they have a rapid test. I know that the schools have been sending home free rapid tests with all students, at least in the elementary school, that is true. What should a person do? They're sick, let's say mildly sick, they have a cough. It's February 1st now, we're in February, it's the winter time, classic Montreal winter. You get a cough and you've had a cough for 3 or 4 days. You take rapid tests, they come back negative. Where do we stand with the accuracy, and what would be your advice?
Okay, so I'll start first with, the question about, the standard Montreal winter and having sort of like just a general kind of upper respiratory illness, or even if a more severe influenza-like illness. So for the past 2 years and the past 2 seasons of respiratory virus seasons, we have not had typical respiratory virus seasons. So there's a couple of theories as to why this may be occurring, but it's not 100% clear. The fact that many people walk around masked all the time, and there is reduced travel, implies that influenza is not traveling around the world like it usually does.
Okay.
And the rates of influenza are dramatically lower than they've ever been over the past 2 years. That has been the case. And we are testing. We don't test as much as we have in the past, but we definitely do test. And there's sentinel labs that report weekly. And there's you can count on your hand how many cases they're finding.
Okay, good.
So the RSV season has come and gone. There was a peak of RSV earlier.
RSV, sorry?
Yeah, it's respiratory syncytial virus. It's something that you see a lot in daycares, highly contagious. It's another respiratory virus.
Okay.
Basically gives you an acquired asthma-like presentation that can last a little longer and you can cough like mad. So there's also adenovirus, which is circulating, and some other viruses. But really, if you compare that to the number of cases of COVID that are circulating, it's like an ant compared to a giant redwood tree. Okay, the numbers are staggeringly different between what is out there in the surveillance laboratories. It's almost all COVID.
Wow.
So if someone has respiratory symptoms, even if they go to a daycare where there's other things around, the likelihood still is that it's COVID. What to
when
do?
the rapid test comes back negative.
Okay. So the first thing I want to do is put out the theory that there's no such thing as a negative rapid test. I interpret the test in this way: positive or not positive. Okay. The sensitivity of these tests are terrible. For someone who is asymptomatic or polysymptomatic, the sensitivity is thought to be somewhere between 40 and 60%. And for someone who has symptoms, it's thought to be maybe between 60 and 80%, but that's probably being extremely generous. We know from previous types of these tests, especially for influenza, that if you have a positive test, it's a very good indicator. They're very specific. It's probably true. If it's negative, it means nothing. So that's why I say don't even call it negative. It means it's not positive.
So with a child who is testing not positive and they have a cough and you cannot get a PCR test, what is the advice?
So if a child had a cough,
or an adult, I'm using one example, but an adult too.
Yeah, so otherwise healthy adults are not eligible for PCR testing, but if you do have certain comorbidities, you are eligible for PCR testing if you're symptomatic. The advice is going to depend on what field you're in and what your daily activities are.
Okay.
So if you're working in a workplace, then it's according to whatever your occupational health guidelines are, most of which will emulate what the province has recommended. That is, if you have symptoms of COVID, do your rapid test. If it's positive, isolate. If it's not positive, then you may have to retest in a day. And if it's still not positive, then come to work with a mask, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you don't have access to a rapid test, then just, isolate yourself for at least 5 days and then hope that it's not COVID. But, all of these things came about because the testing scheme fell apart. And there's basically nothing, there's nothing left for us to kind of detect these events with. The other part of the story is Omicron is super contagious. It's all over the place, but it's also less severe. So it's sort of like accepting the fact that we're dealing with a little bit of a different form of the virus. In a sense, almost allowing a certain part of the population to get sick. Sort of acquiescing to accepting that we've lost the war, quote unquote. People like using battle terms for these things. But I think it's just a matter of resources that are completely overwhelmed by the sheer number of people who are sick simultaneously. So for instance, in a healthcare setting, I can get a PCR because I'm a healthcare worker. But if someone's not in a healthcare setting and they have the same situation, they could be stuck. I've recently had multiple calls from different people telling me that, they have symptoms. There was one who was a physician and his wife tested 3 times negative on a rapid test. And then he finally arranged for her to have a PCR. So I don't know how, wherever. And then anyways, she tested positive on the first PCR. So I could tell you that the rapid tests the reliability is extremely limited. The way the government talks about them and the way many people talk about them, they talk about them as if they are like equivalent to the accuracy of a pregnancy test, which we know are not completely accurate, but they're definitely better than these tests. Now, just because it looks like a pregnancy test, I could tell you it doesn't behave like a pregnancy test. These are, be very careful with your interpretation. I would not use it to allow yourself to, break COVID rules and get together in large groups. It's not a carte blanche to have a bigger party.
That leads on to my next question, which is really, it's perhaps a political question. This is giving you a little bit of freedom and leeway to state your opinion.
It might be a bad idea.
As an informed opinion in the world of medicine and viruses, I see 2 different approaches from a global perspective. There is the New Zealand approach, the Australia approach, which is clamping down right now, extremely tough and heavy. that they are almost trying to stamp out the spread of COVID by individuals one at a time. And what New Zealand has done has been very strong and absolute. And at the opposite extreme has been England, has been Great Britain, in that there are now no masks mandated, there is no social distancing mandated, there are no quarantines being mandated, and there's no isolation should you get it. And this was, I don't know, a week ago, 5 days ago, when this was announced by the British Parliament, I was floored. And I'm left scratching my head because I'm assuming that governments are being led by medical experts. And I'm assuming that to be a doctor in New Zealand and Australia does not mean a radical difference in qualification than it does in Great Britain. So given that governments are polar opposite poles now to how they are mandating the entire country operating, what do you believe should be an appropriate response if you were the final word to the Canadian government? What would be your approach to a medium, or not, maybe not medium, to your opinion?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And you know, that kind of question sort of came upon us, you know, when I was in the conundrum when I was watching in early January the college football championship series and different bowls, right? And you see 100,000 people shoulder to shoulder, no masks, screaming their heads off. And here we can't, you know, at the time, like everything was shut down hard and there was a curfew. And I was trying to figure out, like, you know, I was texting my colleagues in the ID division at the Jewish, and I'm like, guys, you got to turn on the TV and see this. Like, how is this even possible? So the reason that this happens is multifold. So there is a political side to this. You know, I don't think it's a complete coincidence that the British government, you know, went completely, you know, the other way in the midst of Boris Johnson having his personal crises. And then you have the other side of it where you have like Australia and New Zealand, which are islands. So you could add Taiwan into that equation, because they all took very severe measures against COVID, and they all have very low rates of COVID. Because when you're able to, you know, lock out the world, then you're able to do these kind of things. Now, I think we've kind of come to a balance in Canada. You know, maybe it's a little too much still at this point. I don't think getting rid of masks would be a good idea. I think opening up to allow people a little more social interaction at this point would be a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think that these like opening the different measures and dropping the measures should involve proper data-driven benchmarks. It shouldn't be driven by a calendar date. It should be driven by what we're trying to protect, which is the healthcare system. So if the healthcare system demonstrates that it's able to absorb more cases, then sure, open up the next level. But if we can't keep up with the number of surgeries that we have to perform, especially now that we have to catch up on some surgeries, if we can't have enough ICU beds for critical COVID patients, then, you know, what's the point of opening up all these things just to go back into lockdown in a month? You know, right. So we have to be very careful. So I think there is a balance to be achieved for economy, for mental health, for global health. But at the same time, we don't want to land ourselves back in a similar position where we're contemplating lockdowns and curfews again.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much. If you are just joining us, I am here with Dr. Marti Telcher, head of the Walk-in Infectious Diseases Clinic at the Jewish General Hospital, and he is speaking all things Omicron and testing. I'm going to go to social media now. We've had a number of questions that have come in, and from Facebook Live, and I'll just ask them. Do you recommend taking a fourth dose? How long should we wait between doses?
Okay, so there's a historical aspect to this already, believe it or not. It's only been a year or so since we've had the vaccine. So the original interval between, I'll just use the Pfizer vaccine for an example, was 3 weeks. That's what the company studied. They studied it maybe arbitrarily because they wanted to get the study going and get out the results quickly. Some people felt that that was too short an interval. And Quebec also went with a guess. Don't let anybody tell you that it was anything but a guess, because it was a guess in order to ration doses and get as many first doses into as many people as possible.
Wow.
So they did like a napkin, back of a napkin type of mathematics on the data from the New England Journal article. And they said, oh, well, look, it's actually, one shot may offer some protection. So they got as many first shots into people as possible. And then they were saying, your second shot, you could wait. They were telling healthcare workers at the time, even 6 months, you're going to be fine. Wait for 6 months to get your second shot. Then they decided, no, it's a little too long. And as more and more vaccines became available, it went from 6 months down to 4 months, down to 2 months. And then eventually, when we had enough vaccine, they're like, okay, everyone just get your second shot as fast as possible, get it at 4 weeks. But what the data showed ultimately out of BC and out of Quebec was that for the second shot, there's a sweet spot, which is probably about 2 months.
Interesting.
That probably is where your immune system gives you the biggest bang for the buck for the second shot. And it's probably also true for the third shot. So there's something about what happens, after you get a vaccine or after you get infected, where your immune system adapts, responds, and then kind of settles down and lets you benefit more from another exposure. So I give people the same, even though the government was saying after you get infected with COVID, go and get your booster as soon as you feel better. The vast majority of infectious disease people that I've spoken to, and almost our entire division, I'm not the chief of the division, so I'm not speaking on behalf of the division, I'm just telling you what their opinions are, is that, there's definitely a waiting period that is required after you get infected. And that waiting period is probably up to 3 months. I usually tell people 8 to 12 weeks after infection, you can get your third shot. And you should get a third shot.
Now this person who's asking the question is referring to a fourth dose.
Yeah. So the fourth
What's your
dose,
opinion on that?
yeah, the fourth dose thing started in Israel. The preliminary information was that it didn't seem to add much against Omicron if you've already had 3 shots. And I would probably say that that's probably true, that you probably don't need a fourth shot. And people who have like severe immunocompromised states, if they need 4 shots, they probably need 20 shots, because they're probably not going to respond properly no matter how many shots they get.
Right.
So they should be careful nonetheless. I'm waiting out now. I don't think I would get a fourth shot unless it's a year later, or until there's like a newly engineered Omicron shot, which is what they're actually testing now. So that would be my fourth shot if I had a choice.
Right. And just on a follow-up, I think you said it 2 minutes ago, that a person's daughter here got COVID. How long after does she have to wait before getting her second dose? You said about 8 to 12 weeks, correct?
8 to 12 weeks is what we recommend.
Okay. Another question, is there any truth or possibility that vaccines contain carcinogenic ingredients such as nanoparticles and hydrobutyl?
It could be true.
Hydroxybutyl.
Could be true, but it's definitely not true.
Okay, that's an emphatic answer, and I thank you for
that's like anything is possible, but it's not on the listed ingredients.
Yeah,
and that would be extremely unlikely and in the realm of conspiracy theories.
Okay, thank you. Another question coming in from Facebook: how is it possible? Actually, a few people asked this in the Zoom chat as well. If you're tuning in, I'm interviewing Dr. Marti Telcher of the Montreal Jewish Hospital, the Jewish General Hospital. The next question was, how is it possible I didn't get COVID living in a household with people who were positive? I had a husband who was positive and a toddler who was positive. Am I really a superhuman, or am I just in that 10% that doesn't test positive? And a follow-up was that, yes, indeed, it was a PCR test, 2 PCR tests that both showed that this individual was negative. Is she superhuman?
Well, maybe she is superhuman.
Before she asked that question, I always believed she was, even outside of those details, because I think she's a terrific individual. But how did she not catch it?
So look, I don't know the living arrangements, and I don't know what protection she took upon herself or what, the other people in the household took. We know that the attack rate in households is not 100%. For all comers, when they study this, it's, with Omicron, it's higher than the other variants. But even with prior variants, it was somewhere between 20 and 25. And here we're saying it could be 30, 35. So there will be people or members of household that do not have symptomatic COVID, even when exposed to other members of their family. It doesn't mean that they did not have COVID. It means that they could have had an asymptomatic version or a polysymptomatic version. We're only going to know more about this in reality once we're able to actually roll out serology in an effective manner. So serology is the way we do blood testing to test the immune system on what the immune system has been exposed to.
So you're saying that this individual that tested negative when the rest of her household was positive may have previously have caught COVID, was asymptomatic, and as a result of that, maybe a year later, her PCR test is coming back negative.
That's a possibility, or that they actually caught COVID at the same time, but had an asymptomatic version.
Okay.
So it's possible. All of these are possibilities. The only way we would know if someone actually had COVID without testing positive in this type of scenario where there's a high risk exposure is to look back at their immune system and to test whether they have antibodies showing that they had a natural exposure.
Right.
So
okay.
There are tests that do that, but they're not readily available right now.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot of questions. I'm going to see if we can get through all of them. Is Quebec going to allow soon 12-year-olds and over to get their booster shot?
Yeah, so I've been asking around about this for weeks now because I have two children who fall into that age category. It has been, three now, that's right. So one who just moved into the 12-year-old category. She just had her bat mitzvah, got her 12 years and 1 day COVID shot. So she's waiting for her booster now. Yeah, it's true. Wow, man, time flies. Okay, so in the States, it's been approved. In Canada, it has not yet been approved, as far as I know.
Okay.
And even when it's approved in Canada, as we know, Quebec decides to redigest this in various bizarre ways. And we may or may not have our children eligible for this in a timely manner. I'm not involved with this whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
There's a group, which is it's called the CIC, the Comité d'Immunisation du Québec, and they come up with their own guidelines on these things. So we'll wait to hear what they have to say.
Okay, thank you. Next question. When do you think an Omicron-specific vaccine might become available? Or do you think there might be a more concerning variant before a modified vaccine is available?
I'm not aware of any variants of interest so before something becomes a variant of concern, it becomes a variant of interest.
Okay.
So I have not heard of a variant of interest that is circulating at this time that is of concern to the point where they may shift it into the VOC category. And they are studying right now, both Moderna and Pfizer are studying, Omicron designed mRNA vaccines.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
So
thank you. Another question that's coming in through social media. I've read the vaccine for children ages 6 months to 5 years of age may be coming within the next few months. Do you have any information on this? And do you think it's safe to give out when they first start administering it?
So it may be coming out in the States. I'd be shocked if it come out in Canada before the 12 to 18-year-olds. So the FDA is pretty stringent about these things. I don't think they would let, especially with children. That's why most of these studies with vaccines in children actually take a little longer.
Right.
Because they're pretty careful when it comes to children. So if it gets clearance, I would have no reservation about administering it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Another question coming in from Tracy. What are your thoughts on travel at this time?
It's a personal choice. You're going to get the same spiel I tell everyone. It depends on the risk level that you're comfortable accepting. So the risk for travel is really basically, it's not even the airplane that's the problem, it's where you're heading. So if you're heading into the United States, where there's still a ton of COVID, it's still extremely high rates, then you're taking a chance. If you're going to New Zealand, your risk is going to be lower.
Mhm.
Plus, you probably have all sorts of quarantine things you have to go through.
Mhm.
But you know, it also depends on whether you've had COVID or not, and how many vaccine shots you've had, and whether or not you have comorbidities that put you at risk for something, you know, poor outcome. So all of these things, and your personal level of risk acceptance, risk tolerance. So some people are like, you know, you only live once, and I'm going to go do whatever I want. I'm going to get
Right.
on that plane and I'm going wherever. Other people are like me, and we hide in our basements and read the news on streaming media.
Okay. Okay. It's a personal choice. Thank you for that. A similar question to one we had before. There's a slight nuance here, which is would you vaccinate your child who's under 5 once the vaccine becomes available if they had already caught the virus?
That's, you know, I couldn't tell you, because that's a very specific scenario. So for that, I would defer to a pediatrician and what they think, especially pediatric ID individual.
Mhm.
You know, children do have, their immune systems can be a little different than grown individuals, than adults.
Mhm.
So I'm not sure what they would say about that in particular, but that's something I would address. I would defer to a pediatrician for that one.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And one last question from the chat. You may have touched on this earlier. Is it needed for the 12 to 18-year-old age group to get their booster shots? If they've had 2 already, how important is that booster for a 12 to 18-year-old?
Yeah, the booster shot is really the shot that seems to protect against Omicron in some meaningful manner. So if you want the protection against Omicron, which I would encourage everyone to get,
Mhm.
8, 12 and up, then it requires the set of 3. So people, you know, you get into arguments with people about vaccines, and, you know, especially people who are against vaccines, like, oh yeah, well, how many vaccines do you know that require 3 shots? And I'm like, all of them?
Mhm.
Almost every vaccine comes in a set of multiple.
Right,
So, you know, it's
right.
very few vaccines that require a single dose to be effective.
Mhm.
So if you think about the pediatric vaccine series, there's multiple injections at different points in an infant and a youngster's life. If you think about the hepatitis B vaccine, it's the set of 3. If you think about the Shingrix vaccine for adults, it's a set of 2.
Mhm.
So it's not unusual to have a priming dose with a boosting dose once or twice or 3 times. Rabies shot is 5 times.
Wow, amazing.
So
How
this is
quickly we
not
forget
unusual.
in a
Yeah.
world of conspiracy theories are just running rampant. It's amazing. Another question from the Q&A on Zoom. 2 people wrote very similar questions. Can you catch Omicron a second time? Can you get reinfected with Omicron once you've had it?
So within a span of 6 months, that's very unlikely unless you have an immunodeficiency.
Mm-hmm.
Immunodeficiency, anything's possible. But someone who has an intact immune system should rest easy that once they've had it, they're probably set for a good 6 months at least.
Okay. Okay, excellent. Thank you. If you are tuning in, I am interviewing Dr. Marti Telcher, Head of Infectious Diseases at the Walk-in Clinic at the Jewish General Hospital. Marti is answering questions that you may have on Omicron and testing and anything else as we confront and hopefully start to see the end of this latest variant. Marti, what are some of the most important things that people should be aware of? We are now February 2022. It has been a long 2 years. I remember as if it was yesterday, March 13th, waking up in the morning, seeing that email from my school, my children's school. We are closing the school. It was a Friday morning, the 13th of March. And I remember just how foolish we were, how naive we were, how innocent we were when we were discussing the week leading up to that. Maybe we should have a limited kiddush in shul that Shabbat. And that discussion went to, maybe we should plate the food individually and we'll serve the kiddush that way. And then we went to, maybe we should not have kiddush. And then very, very quickly, we were shut down. We were shut down. We are nearly 2 years later. and we're tired. I speak to people and they're tired. I speak to people and they're blah. What was the word that famous New York Times writer? People are languishing. There could be no better word to sum up the mood of so many, so often. People are languishing. What are some of your other pieces of advice that you would like to share with people given this platform that you have this evening?
Yeah, I would say that, this version of COVID gives us the opportunity to ease up a little bit. We have to kind of learn to live with this in a different way. I don't accept that we have to learn with this as an endemic virus. I think that ultimately, I think this will disappear one way or another over time. Or maybe turn into a very, low-level seasonal version of coronavirus, like we see with the other four that are seasonal.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not worried about this being around forever. But right now, if you don't have risk factors that put you at serious risk, which is really immunodeficiencies, certain medications, certain other conditions, then you should try to live a little now, safely, obviously. We're allowed to have people in each other's houses. We're allowed to get back to shul. We're allowed to enjoy restaurants. So I think it's time that people slowly ease into a new mental framework to try to accept that, we have to do some things and we may get infected by accident. Somebody may get infected by accident just because of what we're doing. But if we are otherwise intact immunologically and in relatively good health, it's kind of the risk that we have to accept safely. So I'm not saying, go to a concert with 50 people in a room for 20 people with no windows, with no masks on. I'm saying follow the rules, but get together, enjoy other people's company, come to shul, do the things that you loved doing before this all started and start getting back to it.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much. A few more questions are coming in. At first, the quarantine period was 10 days for a positive result, and now it has gone to 5 days, but with various possible scenarios that increases it to 10 days. Why the changes, and are we still infectious after 5 days?
Yeah. So where did this come from is the first question. So the first question is answered by this. This came about when airlines were basically pushing the CDC to figure out a way to get workers back to work quicker. So the CDC felt that they had data that stated that you're really more infectious about 2 days before symptoms to about 5 days after symptoms. And the last 5 days of your COVID is actually less contagious. What we know from previous variants is that you're probably infectious for 1 to 2 days before symptoms to about 14 days. If you want to go the whole 100%, it's probably about 14 days. The last 4 days of that are probably the lowest risk of them all. So that's where going down to 10 came from. So they felt that 10 made sense. Are you infectious after 5 days? Yes, you are. So the actual policy is to isolate for 5 days, but then afterwards behave like you're still infected, wearing a mask and assuring that you can social distance for another 5 days.
Wow, very important point. Okay.
That second part seems to get lost.
That is very important. Yeah. I have never heard that clearly articulated before. You just said it. That is so important. Thank you so much for that. That's a great clarification. Next question. If I didn't get my booster yet, because I think I may have had COVID in December, despite getting negative rapids, should I wait and get the booster or wait for the Omicron version of the vaccine at this point?
If there's no confirmation about COVID, then you don't know you for sure had COVID. If you had a respiratory syndrome, the most likely thing is that you did have COVID. Yeah. So it's kind of like a circular logic.
Yeah.
So you can do multiple things. You can either hope that they come out with an Omicron vaccine soon, and it's not going to be soon. you're probably looking at something that they're going to prepare for the fall when we head back indoors. That's when I think they're going to roll out an Omicron vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
That would make the most sense, because that's when, we start thinking about flu vaccine, and they can actually combine everything together to make a flu COVID vaccine, or what some people sometimes term flurona. So, because we've seen a couple of those combo cases, but that's a possibility. So what I would do if it was me is I would probably, if I'm looking for my third shot, I would get the third shot. And then you could even get that Omicron shot again in 3 months afterwards. There's no reason why you couldn't do that.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Other questions that are coming in. On the topic of vaccines, I was under the impression that the mRNA technology on the vaccine, specifically Pfizer and Moderna, differed than other vaccines such as AstraZeneca, specifically in their memory component. Can you elaborate on that and the need for so many doses?
Okay, so they're definitely different technologies. So it's a different delivery system.
Mm-hmm.
Every vaccine has a different part of the immune system that it triggers.
Mm-hmm.
That has to do in part with the immunologic response, more so than the antigen presented, or it could be the antigen is the protein that the vaccine provides to raise the immune response. So let me give an example that's not mRNA vaccine first, which is, let's talk about pneumococcal vaccine. So against regular bacterial pneumonia, okay? So we have two sets of vaccines, and they offer different types of immunity. So one is called a conjugate vaccine, and one is called a polysaccharide vaccine. So the conjugate vaccine, also known as Prevnar, most popularly, has a very durable, very intense humoral, which is antibody, and cellular, which is like memory T cell response, very durable. But the current Prevnar is against 13 isolates of pneumococcal bacteria, okay? The second one, which is the polysaccharide, offers protection against 23 different strains, but the protection is not as durable and has more of an antibody level response than a cellular response. And so, what we do is, in people who have immunodeficiency, we actually combine the two. We give them the conjugate followed by the polysaccharide, because of the way the immune system responds differently.
Interesting.
So with mRNA, what we know right now is that there is differences even between the two mRNAs, because they code for slightly different versions of the S protein from coronavirus. And so we've seen that even like in some people, the Moderna vaccine seems to be a little more durable in certain respects than the Pfizer vaccine. But they're both highly effective. Now, if you compare that with other vaccines against COVID, so let's take the other one that was in Canada, the AstraZeneca. AstraZeneca is called a viral vector vaccine. So they actually take an adenovirus, which is a different type of virus. They take out its guts, they repackage it, and they actually use the molecular machinery to enter the cell with the viral protein, with the viral machinery that delivers the DNA message to be translated in the cell. So that's viral vector. And it has more, in some senses, it's more of a natural type of process, but we also know that it comes with a cost, right? Because as we saw with the AstraZeneca vaccine, that there were these unusual side effects, which are attributed in part to the fact that they're using adenovirus. So there's a cost to it, right? We have the clotting disorders, or VIPIT, or whatever you want to call it. So, is there a memory advantage? We don't know much about that. There are studies about memory in immunity, but that is the part of COVID immunity that is probably the least well understood and the least available for testing.
Wow, amazing. Fantastic that the questioner was able to pick up on such a nuanced question. I'm going to move on. We have time for just a couple more questions, and I'd like to get to all of them. You spoke about how the 14-day period, a person can technically still be contagious, even though it's minimal. I don't know if this is a question for you, but the questioner is saying, do you believe in a 14-day quarantine after travel for kids, even if they've already had COVID and they've been isolating for 10 days or more? I think at the moment, the government's regulations are children who have not been vaccinated do require 14 days quarantine.
Yeah.
So,
So the incubation period for COVID, okay, so we're going to learn more and more about Omicron and how like the particularities for Omicron. But for COVID, the incubation period is actually 14 days. And it's sort of similar to the infectivity period. So the infectivity period is really, like we said, we really look at it as 10 days. You could go out to 14, but the studies showed that you can't really culture live virus if you're infected after 10 days. There was a German and a Canadian study that showed that. With incubation, with the other variants, I could tell you that, so the median incubation time for Omicron is thought to be about 3 days. For Delta, it was thought to be 4 to 5 days. And for the originals, like for the Wuhan and Alpha variants, you could say that it was like sort of like, 6 days. So it's getting, the median incubation period is getting shorter and shorter as these things become more and more infectious. And in previous variants, so the median means 50% of cases would present at that point, right? And so we said that at day 10, it was thought that about 97%, day 10, 11, 97% of cases would have declared themselves. So they manifest disease. And then the last 4 days is like represents something like 3% of cases.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the last few questions. You mentioned this briefly in terms of personal choice when it comes to risk. A person's asking, to what degree would you say the risk is there when you're waiting hours prior to boarding a flight, and actually in the airport lounge, there's no social distancing whatsoever?
Well, areas of like smaller spaces and ventilation are obviously higher risk, and that's part of the risk consideration. Like for me, I couldn't even think about going into an airport right now.
Right.
The thought of it, or even an aircraft, even though I know that on an aircraft, your chance of catching COVID is actually not great because of the way the air circulation works.
Right.
Okay. But when I go in an elevator in the hospital, I make sure that there's not more than 4 people in that elevator car. So it's me plus 3, and that's it.
Thank you. I'm going to swiftly move on. I'm sorry to cut you off. You're catching Dr. Marti Telcher, if you're just joining us, who's answering questions on Omicron and testing. Based on the data that we now have, does a vaccinated person spread the virus the same as an unvaccinated person?
I could tell you more about Delta than Omicron, as we're still probably learning about what the actual parameters for Omicron are. So with Delta, it showed that the viral load in people's nasopharynx, so the space behind the physical nose that we see, is equivalent between vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals. But what was also shown was that people who are vaccinated tend to be infectious for a shorter period of time than people who are unvaccinated. So the efficacy with which you can spread the virus while you're contagious is probably the same, but you're not contagious for as long.
Interesting. Another question, can you please discuss the progress made with Longhaul Covid?
Not much that I know about that. As far as infectious disease goes, that's outside the realm of infectious disease as it stands now, because most of that is the infection's long gone. We think, there's some evidence that there could be viral particles left in certain organ parts that might be causing immune reactions, even if the viral particles are no longer active. What I could tell you also is that vaccination reduces the rate of long haul syndrome by 50%. And it's also been shown that people who receive 2 doses of an mRNA vaccine can sometimes be relieved of many of their long hauler syndromes.
Interesting. Thank you.
Unusual. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Another question about children in daycares. They are somewhat being left out of the big picture. They only have to isolate for 5 days. When they come back, it's without a mask, and they risk their classmates and educators. Why is the government leaving out this group?
I have no idea. I can't answer why the government does anything. So I think we're just going to go to the next question, because I'll
Is
probably
it
end up.
true that you should use a rapid test in the throat before the nose for Omicron because it's more accurate?
I don't know if it has to do with Omicron or not, but some kits, they are reporting that some people get better results by doing a nasopharynx or anterior nair plus a throat at the same time on the same swab. So whichever order you prefer, I don't think it really matters. But I guess some people would be a little grossed out by putting a nasal swab in their throat. It might be better the other way, whatever. Some people say that they get better results like that. But
Interesting.
I think it also depends on your kit.
And a very generalized question: if someone has lots of medical problems, insulin dependent, diabetic, high blood pressure, etc., how and when do they integrate back into society?
So those are all risk factors. They're all comorbidities. But there's no reason that someone like that should not properly respond to a vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
The people who I'm most concerned for are people who have issues that are blood disorders, immune disorders,
Mm-hmm.
cancer patients on chemotherapy, immunomodulation therapy for autoimmune disease. These are people that I'm more concerned for than someone with COPD, asthma, diabetes, heart disease, etc., where the vaccines really are effective and should protect.
Excellent.
So
Thank you.
That's what I would say about that. Yeah.
Personal question: would you socialize with an unvaccinated adult?
My question is, why
would you socialize?
In what context?
It was left generic. Let's say at a dinner or.
Well, they're not coming to my house, so no.
They're not coming to your house. Okay.
No.
Okay, there is our answer. We are out of time, I'm afraid, everybody. This has been extremely well attended, both on social media as well as on the Zoom. And who would have thought hundreds of people would have been following this conversation? This has been recorded. We'll be sending it out on the Betic for Thursday Fruit from the Tree email, as well as it is being placed on my Facebook page media feed, and you'll be able to watch and re-listen to this again. I hope that your questions were answered. And I'd like to take this opportunity. Thank you so much, Dr. Telcher, for your time, for your advice, for your wisdom. And we just salute you, as well as all people in the medical industry, nurses, healthcare staff, support staff, and everybody that is doing just a heroic job. We really have been humbled by what you have done and continue to do. Thank you so, so much. You've literally become our modern day heroes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, everybody. I'd like to remind everyone that this time next week on Monday night, we will also be having another Zoom for the community, and we'll be focusing on helping your children overcome their worries. It will be an interview with myself and Jessica Gottlieb, author of the critically acclaimed best-selling book, Being B, which is an interactive book for children ages 6 to 12, empowering them to talk about the tools of overcoming worry and anxiety, dealing with self-confidence. Please join us on Monday night next week. That will be Monday, the 7th of February at 8 p.m. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good evening. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay strong. Synagogue opens its doors on Monday. We welcome you all back in a socially distanced and safe setting. Please come and join us back in person in the synagogue. Have a good night, everybody. Laila Tov.